What if Ned Stark took the Iron Throne? Not because he wanted it. Ned Stark never wanted it. That is the entire point. What if the man who hated the game played it anyway? Not for himself, not for his house. For the same reason Ned Stark does everything, which is because it was right, and because someone had to, and because the alternative was watching everything he believed in burn. Robert is dead. Cersei's children are not his. The evidence is in Ned's hands, and the city is about to tear itself apart around a boy who has no claim, and a queen who will burn the realm rather than yield. And Ned Stark, the most honorable man in Westeros, the man who has never wanted power and has always understood its cost, looks at the board. He looks at what honor costs in this city. He looks at what it cost Jon Arryn. He looks at what it will cost Jon Snow if the Lannisters win. And he makes the choice that goes against everything his nature prefers. He plays. This is not a story about a good man becoming a tyrant. This is a story about what happens when the most honest man in Westeros sits on the most dishonest chair in the world and refuses to become what the chair has made of everyone else who sat in it. This is what Ned Stark does when he finally stops trying to be honorable in a dishonorable world and starts trying to make the world match the honor instead. King's Landing, the Red Keep, 298 AC. Robert is dying. He has been dying since the boar hunt, and Ned has spent the days since sitting at his bedside, watching the dying and trying not to think about what comes after. Because what comes after requires a set of calculations that Ned Stark does not make naturally, and must force himself through the way some men force themselves through cold water. Robert is in the bed. He is large and pale and diminished, which is wrong in a specific way. Because Robert's wrongness has always been the wrongness of too much, too loud, too drunk, too present. This wrongness is the opposite. This is the wrongness of absence. The specific, terrible quiet of a man who filled every room he was ever in, and is now barely filling the room he is dying in. Ned sits beside him. Robert's hand finds his. Robert says, "The boy." Ned says, "He is safe." Robert says, "Joffrey." Ned says, "Yes." Robert is quiet for a moment. He says, "Don't let Cersei." He does not finish the sentence. He does not have to. Ned says, "I won't." Robert says, "She's going to try to." She's been trying to. He says it with the specific, weary knowledge of a man who has known something for a long time and done nothing about it and is now paying the price of the doing nothing. Ned says, "I know." Robert says, "You're the only one, Ned." He says, "You always were." He says it with the grief of a man who understands that he wasted the thing he had. He says, "The only man in 7 kingdoms I trust." Ned says, "Rest." Robert says, "Promise me." Ned says, "Promise you what?" Robert says, "Whatever it takes." He says it with the eyes of a dying man who has finally understood what he was doing wrong. He says, "Whatever it takes. Don't let the Lannisters have it." He says, "Don't let them win." He says, "Whatever it takes, Ned. Promise me that one." Ned looks at his king. He thinks about the last time someone asked him to promise them something. About a tower in Dawn. About the cost of promises. He says, "I promise." Robert dies 3 hours later. Ned sits with him until he does. The Red Keep, the small council chamber. 298 AC. The morning after. The small council assembles. They assemble in the way small councils assemble in the immediate aftermath of a king's death, which is with the performed urgency of people who have been waiting for exactly this and have been rehearsing their positions. Cersei is there. She is wearing gold and green, and she sits with the specific composure of someone who has already decided what this meeting will produce and is waiting for the formality of it to catch up to her decision. Ned enters. He sits at the hand seat. He has the letter. Robert's letter, dictated in the final hours, sealed by the king's own hand. Not the letter Robert wrote before the hunt, the one that said Joffrey's name. The letter Robert wanted written when he knew he was dying and the wine was finally out of him, and what was left was the man underneath the wine. This letter says, "The rightful succession of the realm is to be determined by the Lord Hand in accordance with the laws of the realm and the documented evidence of legitimacy." It says, "I trust Eddard Stark." It does not say Joffrey's name. Ned puts the letter on the table. Cersei looks at it. She looks at it with the specific attention of a woman who knows immediately what she is looking at and what it means. She says, "That letter is not the one my husband dictated." Ned says, "It is the one he dictated on his deathbed." He says, "The previous letter was written before he had full knowledge of the succession question." Cersei says, "What succession question?" Ned looks at her. He says, "Lady Cersei." He says, "We can do this 2 ways." He says it with the quiet of a man who has thought through both ways and knows which one he would prefer and knows which one he is prepared to take if necessary. He says, "We can do this in this room with the small council in the way of civilized people who are capable of receiving truth." He says, "Or we can do it in the throne room in front of the court with everything that entails." He says, "The choice is yours." He says, "But the question is going to be answered either way." The room is very quiet. Cersei says, "What question?" Ned says, "The question of Joffrey's parentage." The room does not change its temperature, but the quality of the air changes. The way the air changes in the moment before a storm when everything goes still. Pycelle begins to speak. Varys watches. Littlefinger's face does the thing it does when he is calculating faster than the situation is moving. Cersei says, "Choose your next words very carefully, Lord Stark." Ned says, "Joffrey Baratheon is not Robert's son." He says it plainly, the way he says everything plainly. He says he is the son of Sir Jaime Lannister and Queen Cersei. He says the evidence is documented. He says Jon Arryn died finding it. He says it is not in question. Cersei stands. Ned says, "Sit down, my lady." She says, "You do not tell me to." Ned says, "I am the hand of the king." He says, "And until the question of succession is resolved, I speak with the king's authority." He says, "Sit down." She sits. Not because she is controlled, because she is calculating. Because Cersei Lannister knows when a situation requires the appearance of compliance, while the real response is being assembled. Ned looks at the table. He says, "The line of succession passes to Stannis Baratheon." He says, "Lord Stannis is Robert's true heir." He says, "I am dispatching ravens today to inform Lord Stannis of his king's death and to invite him to King's Landing to assume the throne." Pycelle says, "Your Grace." Ned says, "I am not your grace." He says it with the specific correction of a man who is aware of the title and is not taking it. He says, "I am the hand." He says, "The hand serves the realm until the rightful king is seated." Littlefinger says, "Lord Stark, this is a delicate situation." He says it with the warmth of a man who has been waiting for a delicate situation and is pleased it has arrived. He says, "The people know Joffrey as the prince, a sudden revelation of illegitimacy." He says, "The city will not take it well." Ned says, "The city will take the truth." He says, "Truth is what it is regardless of what the city takes." Littlefinger says, "That is an admirable position." He says, "It is also, if you will forgive me, the position of a man who hasn't governed this city before." Ned looks at him. He says, "Lord Baelish." He says, "I am aware that you have been embezzling from the crown for years." He says, "I am aware of the specific mechanism and the approximate amount." He says, "I have not yet decided what to do about it." He says, "What I am deciding in this moment is whether to decide now or later." He says, "I would suggest your next contribution to this discussion be constructive." The room is very quiet. Littlefinger says nothing. Ned says, "The ravens go today." He says, "Stannis Baratheon is the rightful king." He says, "Until he arrives, this council governs in his name." He says, "That is all." He stands. He looks at Cersei. She looks at him. There is a conversation happening in this look that does not require words. She is telling him, "You have no idea what you have started." He is telling her, "I know exactly what I have started." Both of them are right. He walks out. The Red Keep, Ned's chambers, that night. He sits alone. He has been sitting alone since the council meeting. His chambers are quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when the person in them has too much to think about for conversation to be useful. He has made several decisions today. He makes decisions the way he does everything, by thinking about what is right and then doing it. The thinking takes time. The doing, once decided, is immediate and complete. He decided, the ravens to Stannis go tonight. They are already written. They are being sealed now. Stannis will receive word in 2 days at Dragonstone. The City Watch is being reassigned, not to Lannister Command, to Baratheon Command. He has spoken to the commander, a man named Janos Slynt, who is venal and unreliable, and who is going to be replaced within the week. He has not told Slynt he is being replaced. He has told Slynt that the Watch reports directly to the Hand now. Slynt accepted this with the compliance of a man who expected worse and received better, and has not yet understood that better is only temporary. Jaime Lannister is in the city. This is the problem Ned has been thinking about longest. Jaime Lannister commands a force of Lannister soldiers within the city walls. Jaime Lannister is aware, with high certainty, of what happened in the small council chamber today. Jaime Lannister is his sister's champion and his father's instrument, and he is somewhere in this city, making a decision about what today means and what comes next. Ned thinks about Jaime. He thinks about what Jaime is and what Jaime is not. Jaime Lannister is the Kingslayer. He killed Aerys when Aerys was going to burn the city. That is an act that Ned has judged for 15 years as a violation of oaths, as the worst of all possible breaks with honor. And he has stood by that judgment because the integrity of oaths is load-bearing in the world as Ned understands it. He has been thinking about that judgment today. He has been thinking about what it means when a man breaks his oath to save 600,000 people, and the world calls him dishonorable anyway. He has been thinking about what it means to be the most honorable man in the room and have the honor be the thing that gets people killed. He has been thinking about himself. He is honest enough to be thinking about himself. He thinks, I have been refusing to play the game for the 15 years of my life as a lord, and the cost of that refusal has been paid by everyone around me, and I have called the refusal virtue. He sits with this. He thinks, Robert asked me to promise whatever it takes. He thinks, I promised. He picks up a quill. He writes a letter to Jaime Lannister. He writes, Sir Jaime, I am writing to you directly because I believe you deserve directness. The situation is what it is. The evidence is documented. Stannis will be king. He says in the letter what his judgment of you has been. And then he says this, I believe I have been wrong. He writes, you killed Aerys because Aerys was going to burn the city. That was not the act of a man without honor. That was the act of a man who chose a harder honor over an easier oath. He says, I did not understand this until I was put in the position of choosing between an easier oath and a harder honor. He says, I understand it now. He says, I am not offering you absolution. That is not mine to give. He says, I am offering you a choice. He says, stand down your soldiers, support the lawful succession, and I will hear your account of the night Aerys died. The full account, the way it happened. He says, whatever you are owed by the world after that night, it was not the contempt you received. He folds the letter. He seals it. He calls for a trusted rider and sends it tonight. Then he sits in his chair and he looks at the city through the window and he thinks about Jon Snow. He thinks about the boy in Winterfell who has Lyanna's eyes and who does not know what he is. He thinks, if the Lannisters win, Jon is the first thing they destroy. He thinks, I promised Robert whatever it takes. He picks up the quill again. He writes the second letter. This one is to Catelyn, King's Landing, Jaime Lannister, the next morning. Jaime reads the letter twice. He is in his quarters in the White Sword Tower, the Kingsguard's specific domain, the place where men who have given up family and inheritance and the ordinary ambitions of lords come to live with the consequences of their oaths. He reads it a second time. He sets it down. He goes to the window. He looks at the city. The city Aerys was going to burn. The city he saved by doing the thing that cost him everything he had built his life on. Not his conscience, not his honor. Those survived the killing. But his reputation, his standing in the world's eyes, the specific image of himself that the world reflected back. He has been living in the shadow of that killing for 15 years. He has been called Kingslayer for 15 years. He has worn the word the way you wear something ugly that you cannot take off, with the specific defensive indifference of someone who has decided that performing not caring is preferable to showing how much it costs. He reads the letter a third time. I believe I have been wrong. He sits with those words. He is Jaime Lannister. He has not spent much of his life receiving that sentence from people who matter to him. It is given rarely, and when it is given, it is usually conditional and backloaded with requirements that make the giving less than it sounds. This one is not conditional. He thinks about what it costs Eddard Stark to write that. He thinks about what it costs a man who has built his entire identity on honor to say to another man, "My judgment of your honor was wrong." He thinks, this is either the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 15 years, or the most sophisticated manipulation I have ever encountered. He thinks about Ned Stark. He thinks, it is the most honest thing anyone has said to him in 15 years. He writes back. He writes, I will stand down my soldiers. He writes, Joffrey's claim is false, and I have known it for longer than I should have allowed it to matter. He writes, if you want the full account of the night Aerys died, I will give it. He writes, the whole of it, without the parts I have omitted, because no one was interested in the parts I omitted. He writes, Lord Stark, whatever you are doing, I hope you understand what it will cost you. He writes, this city breaks people who try to be what you are trying to be. He says, I have watched it happen. He says, I do not want to watch it happen to you. He folds the letter. He sends it. He goes to his men and he tells them to stand down. His men look at him. He says, stand down. He says it with the authority of a man who has learned to give commands that people do not question, and who is using that authority now in the direction that his letter to Ned Stark has chosen. The soldiers stand down. Jaime stands in the courtyard. He thinks, I just chose a side. He thinks, I have not chosen a side in 15 years. He has been standing aside, declaring himself above the game, wearing the white cloak as the specific armor of a man who refuses to play. He chose. He breathes. He thinks, let's see what Ned Stark does with it. The Red Keep, 3 days later, the city holds. This is not a certainty Ned expected. He expected the city to erupt in the way that cities erupt when the stability they are built on is revealed to have been a performance. He expected riots. He expected the Lannister soldiers to be a problem before Jaime's letter arrived. He expected Cersei to move faster and more overtly than she has. What happens instead is something more complicated and in some ways more dangerous. The city watches, not passively, actively. The small folk of King's Landing have been alive under kings for generations, and they have developed the specific political sensitivity of people who know that what happens above them will fall on them eventually. They are watching the hand. They are watching the queen. They are watching the color of the sky, the way people watch the sky when they know a storm is coming and are deciding whether to stay or run. Ned gives them something to watch. He opens the Red Keep's gates. This is radical, and he knows it is radical, and he does it anyway, because it is the right thing, and because the right thing in this situation is also strategically sound, which is a combination he has not previously had, the experience of these two things aligning. He opens the gates and he holds court. Not the formal court of the king, the ceremony and the performance of power that Robert found intolerable and conducted infrequently. Ned's court is a different thing. It is people from the city coming to the gates with their problems and being admitted to the Great Hall where Ned or his designated representatives hear them. The first day, it is a woman whose husband was pressed into service by a Lannister soldier and has not been seen in 3 weeks. Ned hears her. He finds the husband. He was being used as labor in a Lannister supply depot. He is returned. The second day, it is a merchant whose goods were confiscated for failure to pay a tax he says was collected twice. Ned reviews the records. The tax was indeed collected twice. The goods are returned. The third day, There are 40 people at the gate. He hears them all. It takes most of the day. His steward tells him, this is not how a hand functions. Ned says, then I am functioning differently. Varys comes to him on the third evening. He comes with the specific soft footstep that announces nothing and delivers Varys as a fact. Present in the room before his arrival has been registered. He says, the city is talking about you. Ned says, I am not interested in what the city says about me. Varys says, you should be. He says it with the gentle precision of someone making a point he believes matters. He says, the city is saying that the hand opens the gates and hears grievances and returns things that were taken, and that in 6 years under Robert, nothing like this has happened. He says, they are saying this in taverns and in markets and in the way that things spread through King's Landing when they capture something people have been wanting to say. Ned says, what are they saying? Varys says that you are the first honest man to sit at that table in a long time. He says they are saying it carefully because they have learned that saying such things too loudly has consequences. He says, but they are saying it. Ned looks at his desk. He has been at this desk for 18 hours. He says, what does Cersei do? Varys says, she writes letters to her father. He says, Tywin is in the Westerlands. He says, the letters have been going for 3 days. Ned says, how long before Tywin responds with soldiers? Varys says, he may not. He says it with the careful delivery of someone presenting information they want received exactly right. He says, Lord Tywin is a man of calculation. He has been calculating this situation since the Ravens went to Dragonstone. He says, the calculation includes several variables that were not present when Cersei expected him to mobilize. Ned says, name them. Varys says, Lord Jaime's support for your position. He says, the documentation of the succession claim, which is impeccable, and which Tywin knows he cannot legally challenge. He says, and you. He says it with a pause before it, the pause of a man building to a point. He says, Lord Tywin did not expect you to be what you are proving to be. Ned says, what am I proving to be? Varys says, a man who knows what he is doing. He says, Tywin expected you to act the way you acted in your first days here. Honorably, directly, without the game. He says, he did not expect you to open the gates. Ned says, it was the right thing to do. Varys says, yes. He says, it is also the strategically brilliant thing to do. He says, the city's loyalty, Lord Stark, is the one resource in King's Landing that cannot be purchased or intimidated. It can only be earned. He says, you are earning it. He says, Tywin knows this, and Tywin respects it even when he is opposed to it. Ned is quiet. He says, I did not open the gates to earn loyalty. Varys says, I know. He says, that is precisely why it worked. King's Landing, Cersei, those same days. Cersei has 3 problems. She identifies them in the specific systematic way she identifies problems, which is immediately and in order of threat. First, the documentation is real. She has seen enough of it to know that Ned Stark did not fabricate what he brought to the small council. The birth records, the Baratheon lineage, the evidence Jon Arryn died gathering. It is real and it is documented, and the documentation has been copied and distributed in ways that mean destroying the original copies does not solve the problem. Second, Jaime stood down his soldiers. This is the one she did not see coming. She expected Jaime to act. She expected Jaime to do what Jaime always does when she is threatened, which is move toward the threat and eliminate it. Instead, he wrote Ned Stark a letter about honor and told his men to stand down and came to tell her personally that he thought she should negotiate. She told him things she regrets saying. He left. He is somewhere in the castle, and she does not know where. And that is the specific kind of not knowing that Cersei finds intolerable. Third, her father is not responding the way she expected. Tywin's letters are measured. They are not the letters of a man who is mobilizing. They are the letters of a man who is assessing, who is watching, who is... She reads between the lines with the specific intimacy of a daughter who has read her father's correspondence all her life, considering the possibility that Ned Stark is a development rather than a problem. Tywin considers very few people development. She goes to Ned. She does not announce herself. She arrives at his solar door and knocks and enters before the answer comes. He is at the desk. He looks up. She closes the door. She sits. He looks at her. She says, "What do you want?" Ned says, "What do I want?" She says, "From me. From my family. You have the succession arranged. Stannis is coming. The documentation is in distribution. You have won." She says it with the specific flatness of a woman who says words that cost her without letting the cost show. She says, "What do you want?" Ned says, "I want your children to live." He says it simply. He says, not as heirs, not as royalty. He says, Joffrey and Myrcella and Tommen deserve to be alive and safe. He says, that is what I want for them. Cersei looks at him. She is trying to find the angle, the manipulation, the thing underneath the words that the words are covering. She is very good at finding this in people, and she is not finding it. She says, "And me." Ned says, "I want you to understand something before you make your next move." He says it with the weight of a man who has thought about this speech and is giving it exactly as he prepared it. He says, "The Lannisters have gold and soldiers and the loyalty of a great house." He says, "I have the loyalty of the city and the documentation and the law." He says, "If you force a conflict, people die." He says, "That is what conflict means. People die." He says, "Your children among them potentially." He says, "That is not a threat." He says, "That is what war is." He says, "I have been to war." He says, "I know what it takes from people." He looks at her. He says, "I am not your enemy, Lady Cersei." He says, "I am the man who stands between your children and what Stannis would do to them without me here to moderate it." He says, "Stannis is just." He says, "He is not merciful." He says, "The difference between just and merciful is the difference between your children living and not." She looks at him. She says, "You are asking me to trust you." He says, "I am asking you to consider that I have not lied to you." He says, "I have not lied to anyone in this city." He says, "That is a strange quality in King's Landing." He says, "But it means my word is something you can actually calculate with." He says, "I mean what I say about your children." She's quiet for a long moment. She says, "And Jaime?" Ned says, "Jaime is a member of the Kingsguard. His place is at the Kingsguard." He says, "I have no intention of moving against Jaime." He pauses. "I owe Jaime a conversation." He says, "When Stannis is here and the succession is settled, I intend to have it." Cersei looks at him. She says, "You are a very strange man, Lord Stark." Ned says, "I have been told." She stands. She goes to the door. She stops. She says without turning, "If you are lying to me, if anything happens to my children because you said they would be safe and they were not," she says, "I will find a way." Ned says, "I know," he says, "nothing will happen to them." She leaves. Ned sits at his desk. He thinks, that went as well as it could have, and also nothing is settled, and Tywin Lannister has not moved, and Stannis has not arrived, and the city is watching, and anything could still happen. He picks up the next petition. He keeps working. King's Landing, Tywin's Raven, Day 7. Tywin's Raven arrives on the 7th day. Ned reads it at his desk. He has been waiting for it. He has been tracking the days and calculating the time it would take for a raven to reach Casterly Rock and a response to return. And he has been prepared for the response to be the mobilization of Lannister forces. He reads, the letter says, "Lord Stark, you have managed this situation with more competence than I anticipated, and with more fairness than I believed a Northerner capable of in the specific context of Southern politics." He says, "I have been receiving reports." He says, "The city has not erupted." He says, "Jaime stood down without bloodshed." He says, "The documentation is impeccable." He says, "Stannis arrives with the fleet in 4 days." He says, "I will not mobilize." He says this sentence by itself, with the specific weight of a decision being conveyed as settled. He says, "The Lannister position in the realm under Stannis is a question for a later conversation." He says, That conversation requires you to still be hand when it occurs. He says, "My children will not be harmed." Ned reads this sentence again. He understands what it means. It is not a request. It is not a condition. It is Tywin Lannister telling him what the acceptable outcome is, and trusting that Ned Stark is the kind of man who will deliver it, because Ned Stark's word is Ned Stark's word. Tywin has calculated Ned correctly. Ned says to the letter, "Your children will not be harmed." He says it out loud, to the empty room, to the air, to whatever gods are present in King's Landing, which he suspects are different gods from the ones in Winterfell, but gods nonetheless. He writes back. He writes, "Lord Tywin, your children will not be harmed." He writes, "I give you my word on this." He says, "I know what my word is worth to you." He says, "I know it is worth exactly as much as I demonstrate it to be through my actions." He says, "I have 11 days of actions so far." He says, "They should tell you something." He writes, "I would ask one thing from you in return." He says, "Not gold." He says, "Not soldiers." He says, "Send Tyrion to King's Landing." He folds the letter. He seals it. He calls for a rider. He sends it. His steward says, "Tyrion Lannister." He says it with the specific tone of someone who has opinions they are not quite expressing. Ned says, "Tyrion Lannister is the most capable person in that family." He says, "I need capable people." He says, "Every person I send a letter to that says I need capable people, I am naming Tyrion Lannister." He says, "Capable is what I need." He says, Tywin will send him because Tywin wants Lannister influence at court, and the most effective Lannister influence comes in the form of the one his family consistently wastes. His steward says, "Lord Tywin may not agree." Ned says, "Lord Tywin will agree because it is correct, and he knows it is correct, and Tywin Lannister does not reject correct things for sentimental reasons." His steward says nothing. He goes. Ned goes back to the petitions. Dragonstone. Stannis. 5 days later. Stannis Baratheon reads Ned's Raven. He reads it with the expression he gives everything, which is the expression of a man weighing it on scales of principle that never leave his hands. Davos is in the room. Stannis says, Stark moves quickly. Davos says, "He does, my lord." Stannis says, "Jaime Lannister stood down his soldiers." Davos says, "According to this, yes." Stannis reads the letter again. He is a man who does not trust easily, because he has been given too many reasons not to. He is a man who was passed over for Storm's End, who watched Robert celebrate victories and distribute rewards and receive the love of the lords, and was given the correct portion rather than the generous one, because Stannis is the correct portion of everything, the one that does what it is supposed to do, without excess or drama or the kind of warmth that makes people feel they have been given more than they expected. He has waited for this, not the throne. He has never wanted the throne the way people want things they desire. He has wanted it the way he wants everything that is rightfully his, which is with the cold inevitability of someone who will wait for the correct accounting to produce the correct result. The correct result is arriving. He says, "What is Stark's position?" Davos says, "From the letters, it seems he intends to hold the city until you arrive and then step aside." Stannis says, "He opens the gates. He holds court. He manages Cersei. He neutralizes the Lannister soldiers. And then he steps aside." Davos says, "Yes, my lord." Stannis is quiet. He says, "That is a man who does not want power." Davos says, "So it would seem." Stannis says, "I have met very few of those." He says it with the flat observation of a man noting a rare fact. He says, "They are either the most trustworthy people in existence or the most dangerous." He says, "Because the man who does not want power has nothing you can take from him." Davos says, "Is that good or bad for us?" Stannis says, "Both." He says, "Prepare the fleet." He says, "We sail tomorrow." He says, "I want to be in King's Landing within the week." Davos says, "My lord." He pauses. "What about Lady Selyse?" "The Red Woman." Stannis says, "Melisandre stays at Dragonstone." He says it with the flat decisiveness of a man who has made a calculation. He says, "What Stark is building in King's Landing does not require prophecy." He says, "It requires law." Davos says, and Stark is law. Stannis says, Stark is the closest thing to law this realm has produced in 30 years. He says, I am not going to complicate that with fire priests. He folds the letter. He goes to prepare for the sailing. The Red Keep. Varys, day 2. Varys comes to him on the second morning. He comes with his habitual soft-footedness and his folded hands and his face arranged in the expression that Ned has spent months deciding is not warmth and not neutrality, but something between them. The specific effect of a man who has genuine investment in outcomes and genuine uncertainty about whether to reveal the investment. He sits across from Ned without being invited. Ned has stopped reacting to this. The castle operates on its own protocols, and Varys' protocols include treating the Lord Hand Solar as a shared workspace, which Ned has decided is useful enough to tolerate. Varys says, You have moved faster than I expected. Ned says, I moved as fast as the situation required. Varys says, Most men in your position would have spent the first 3 days managing their own fears. He says, You spent them managing the cities. Ned says, The city's needs are more urgent than my fears. Varys looks at him. He says, I have been in this castle for many years. He says, I have served many men in positions of power. He says, I have watched each of them in the first days of unexpected authority. He says, the first days reveal what a man actually is beneath what he presents. He says, I have been watching you. Ned says, and Varys says, and you are exactly what you appear to be. He says it with the specific quality of someone finding this both remarkable and faintly disorienting. He says, in my experience, that is the most unusual quality a man in King's Landing can possess. Ned says, What do you want, Varys? Varys says, The same thing I have always wanted. He says, A realm that does not tear itself apart. He says, People capable of governing it without destroying it in the process. He says, he pauses. You are the third person I have met in 30 years of serving this city who I believe might be capable of both. Ned says, Who are the other two? Varys says, Jon Arryn. He says, and someone whose time has not yet come. He says it with the careful delivery of someone who has decided not to say a specific name. Ned looks at him. He says, Jon Snow. Varys is very still. He says, You know. Ned says, I have always known. He says it with the weight of 15 years. He says, He is my nephew. Varys says, And you have never. Ned says, No. He says, The promise required silence. He says, I kept the silence. Varys says, The promise to Lyanna Stark. Ned says, Yes. Varys says, Lord Stark. He says it with the quality of a man arriving at something he has been building toward. He says, I have known about Jon Snow for 11 years. He says, I have been protecting the secret through my own channels for 11 years. He says, I did not tell you because I did not know if you knew, and revealing the secret to the wrong person would have been catastrophic. Ned looks at him. He says, You have been protecting him. Varys says, I serve the realm. He says, he is necessary for what the realm is about to face. He says, protecting him was serving the realm. He says it was also the right thing. He says it with the specific addition of that last phrase, the thing beyond the calculation, that tells Ned something about Varys he has not been sure of until now. Ned says, Why are you telling me this now? Varys says, Because you are now in a position where the information is relevant and you are the right person to receive it. He says, and because working together with full information is more efficient than working separately with partial information. He says, he pauses, and because I have been waiting a long time to be able to say out loud that I have been working to protect a Stark's promise, and I would like someone who matters to know it. Ned looks at this man. He has distrusted Varys since he arrived in King's Landing. He has distrusted him with the instinctive distrust of a northern lord encountering a southern court creature, the man who knows everything and tells you only what serves him. He looks at him now differently. He says, Thank you. He says it simply. He says, for keeping him safe. Varys says, Thank your sister. He says, she chose to leave him somewhere that the old gods watch over. Ned says, She always knew where to find the places worth trusting. Varys says, yes. He pauses. She did. They sit for a moment with this between them, the shared weight of keeping a dead woman's wish alive for 15 years. Then Ned says, I need your help. Varys says, you have it. Ned says, all of it? Varys says, all of it that serves the realm. He says it with the honesty of someone who has never pretended to a loyalty that is not conditional on outcomes. He says, which, in this case, is all of it. They get to work. King's Landing. The week of waiting. The week Ned waits for Stannis is the most complicated week of his life. Not because dramatic things happen. The opposite. The week is a week of small things, of the daily management of a city that is holding its breath, of the specific maintenance of stability that requires constant attention and produces no visible result, because the visible result of stability is the absence of catastrophe, which is invisible. He hears petitions. He hears 40 on the 4th day, 60 on the 5th. He is in the Great Hall from dawn until dark, and his steward tells him he cannot continue this. And he says, find me more people to hear the petitions who can be trusted, and we will continue. His steward finds 2 men he vouches for, and they begin hearing petitions alongside Ned, and the number is manageable. He deals with Janos Slynt. He replaces Slynt with a man named Ser Barristan Selmy, who has been waiting, Ned suspects, for someone to ask him to be useful in a way that does not compromise his honor. Barristan accepts the expanded role with the quiet dignity of someone who has been waiting to be used properly. He deals with Littlefinger. He calls Littlefinger into his solar, and he says, you have been embezzling from the crown for 6 years. He says, the specific mechanism is this. He describes the mechanism. Littlefinger's face does the thing it does when he is recalibrating rapidly. He says, you will repay the full amount. He says, you will do this quietly, and you will not make it known that you were given the opportunity to repay, rather than prosecuted. He says, in exchange, you will remain as master of coin, because you are very good at it despite the theft, which I find both impressive and deeply irritating. He says, the accounts will be audited quarterly. He says, is that acceptable? Littlefinger says, that is acceptable. He says it with the specific quality of someone who expected the stick and received the stick and the carrot simultaneously and is still processing. He says, Lord Stark, you are not what I expected. Ned says, no. He says, I never am. He deals with Pycelle. He summons Pycelle and tells him about the poison in Robert's wine and the specific substances that Pycelle has been providing at Cersei's instruction, and that he has documentation of this through Varys's channels, and that Pycelle will resign his position immediately and retire to the Citadel, and that if he does not, the documentation will be presented to the new king when Stannis arrives, and the new king will not be merciful. Pycelle resigns. He deals with Sansa. His daughter has been in the city and has been being managed by the situation around her in the specific way that Sansa manages being managed, which is with surface compliance and a deeper quality that Ned is only now watching it, recognizing as intelligence waiting for the right conditions. He calls her to his solar. He says, I am sending you north. She says, Father, he says, I am sending you north because what comes next requires stability. And stability is not something I can guarantee in this city for some months. He says, you are safe in Winterfell. He says, Rob is there. She says, I want to stay. He looks at her. He says, why? She says, because you are going to need people around you who you can trust. She says it with the specific quiet of someone who has been thinking about this for longer than the conversation suggests. She says, you sent away Jon and Benjen, and you have Jory, but Jory is a guard, not a counselor, and you need someone who can... She stops. She says, I can be useful here. I know how this court works. I have been watching it for months. Ned looks at his daughter. He thinks about Catelyn's letter. He thinks about what the North is. He thinks about what he is trying to build here, and what building it requires. He says, what have you observed? In the months you have been here, she tells him. She tells him for 20 minutes without stopping, the specific, detailed account of a person who has been watching with the attentiveness of someone who understood very early that the watching was her only available tool. Ned listens. When she finishes, he says, "You understand that this is dangerous?" She says, "I know." He says, "You understand that if things go wrong?" She says, "I know that too." She says, "I am staying." He looks at his daughter. He thinks about Lyanna, about a girl who was never afraid of anything and who made choices that she was told not to make, and who burned the world with the choosing and built something from the burning. He says, "You stay." He says, "But you report to me daily." He says, "Everything you observe." He says, "You are not performing for this court. You are watching it." Sansa says, "Yes, father." She goes. Ned sits at his desk. He thinks, the wrong people keep surprising me. He thinks, perhaps I've been wrong about what people are for a long time. He picks up the next petition. King's Landing. Jaime Lannister. Day 9. Ned keeps his promise about the conversation. He goes to Jaime. He finds him in the White Sword Tower, in the room that is the Kingsguard's specific province, the room where the White Books live, the record of every Lord Commander and their service. Jaime is reading the book. He looks up when Ned enters. He closes it. Ned sits. Jaime looks at him. He says, "You came." Ned says, "I said I would." He says, "You said a lot of things in that letter." Ned says, "I meant all of them." Jaime says, "Even the part about being wrong." Ned says, "Especially that part." He says it with the difficulty it deserves, the specific difficulty of a man who has built his life on the absolute reliability of his own judgment and is confronting the limits of it. He says, "Tell me what happened." Jaime tells him. He tells it fully, the way he has never told it, not to Cersei, not to his father, not to anyone, because no one ever asked for the full account, and when no one asks, you stop finding ways to give it. He tells it to Ned Stark. He tells him about Aerys's specific madness that night. Not the general madness that everyone knew about, the burning of individuals, the wildfire experiments, the specific quality of a mind that had dissolved its own structure, and what lived in the gap. He tells him about the cache of wildfire beneath the city. He tells him about Rossart and the plan to burn everything rather than yield. He tells him about the moment he made the decision and what the decision felt like, and what it cost him in the moment and what it has cost him every day since. He tells him about the throne room, about sitting on the Iron Throne, about Robert arriving, and the look on Robert's face and what Robert said and how Robert said it. He tells Ned, "I could have explained." He says, "I could have said what I said to you." He says, "I chose not to." He says, "Because I had just killed a king, and I was sitting on his throne, and I was tired in a way I cannot adequately describe, and I did not have the words for it." He says, "I have not had the words for it for 15 years. He says, and the world filled the silence with Kingslayer. Ned is quiet for a long time. He says, "You saved the city." Jaime says, "Yes." Ned says, "And the world called you Oathbreaker." Jaime says, "Yes." Ned says, "I was one of the people who called you Oathbreaker." Jaime says, "Yes." Ned says, "I am sorry." He says it plainly, the way he says everything plainly, without decoration, as the complete and honest statement it is. Jaime stares at him. He says, "You are apologizing to the Kingslayer." Ned says, "I am apologizing to the man who made the only available choice and has been living with the cost of it for 15 years, while the people who called him Kingslayer have not examined their own assumption of what honor requires." He says, "Honor is not about which oath you kept." He says, "It is about what you protected." He says, "You protected 600,000 people." He says, "That is what honor is." Jaime is very still. He has been Sir Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, for so long that he has not thought about what he is underneath the name. He has built a life inside the name, made a kind of armor from it. The armor of someone who wears the insult as a badge, because the alternative is feeling what the insult has done. He looks at Ned Stark. He says, "What do you want from me?" Ned says, I want you to be what you have always been, which is the finest sword in Westeros. He says, I want you to serve the realm the way you served it that night, which is by protecting what needs protecting, regardless of the cost to your own standing. He says, I want you in the Kingsguard under Stannis. He says, serving honestly. Jaime says, Stannis despises me. Ned says, Stannis respects evidence. He says, the evidence of what you did and why is going to be documented and distributed the same way the evidence about Joffrey was documented and distributed. He says, the full account. He says, in your words. He says, it will not undo 15 years. He says, but it will be true. Jaime looks at the white book. He looks at the page where his entry is. The shortest entry of any Kingsguard in the history of the Order. The entry that records what he did, and nothing else. No context. No account. Just the act named in the most unflattering possible way, and left there in the permanent record of his shame. He says, and the book. Ned says, the book gets the full entry. He says, what you did, why you did it. He says, whatever you want it to say. He says, in your words. He says, the world is going to know. Jaime looks at him. He says, you are rewriting the Kingsguard records. Ned says, I am completing them. He says, there is a difference. Jaime looks at the book. He closes it. He says, all right. He says it with the quiet of someone setting down something they have been carrying for a very long time. He says, Lord Stark. He says, for what it's worth. He says, Robert made the wrong choice when he gave the hand to Jon Arryn instead of you the first time. Ned says, Jon Arryn was a great man. Jaime says, he was. He says, so are you. He says, they are not the same thing. King's Landing, Stannis arrives. Day 11. The fleet arrives in Blackwater Bay on the 11th day. Ned watches from the walls. Stannis Baratheon's black sails with the crowned stag, no longer stag and lamp, just stag. The Baratheon sigil unadorned, the signal of a man who has decided to arrive as himself rather than as Melisandre's prophet. Ned takes this as a good sign. The city watches. The city has been watching for 11 days, and it knows what this fleet means, and the watching has a different quality today. Not the watching of people waiting to see what disaster arrives. The watching of people who have been given, in 11 days of open gates, and heard petitions and returned goods, and the replacement of Slint with Barristan, a reason to want the person in charge to continue being in charge. The fleet docks. Stannis comes ashore. He looks exactly like what he is, which is a man who has been waiting to be king for his entire life, and is arriving at the moment without joy and without false modesty, and with the flat, complete intention of someone who is going to do what he came to do, and do it correctly. He looks at Ned. Ned looks at him. Stannis says, Lord Stark. Ned says, Lord Stannis. Stannis says, you held the city. Ned says, the city held itself. He says it without false modesty. He says, I opened the gates. Stannis says, I have been reading the reports. He says, you also replaced the City Watch commander, neutralized the Lannister soldiers without violence, restructured the Master of Coins accounting, replaced the Grand Maester, and heard petitions daily for 11 days. He says, for a man who does not want power, you wielded it with considerable effectiveness. Ned says, I wanted the city to be ready for you. He says, it is ready. Stannis looks at him, He says, and what do you want in return? Ned says, nothing for myself. He says it directly. He says, for the realm, I want 3 things. He says, I want the truth about Joffrey's parentage entered into the official record and distributed to every great house. He says, I want the account of Sir Jaime's killing of Aerys entered into the Kingsguard record in full. He says, and I want Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen to live safely as Lannisters, not as prisoners or threats. Stannis is quiet. He says, you are asking me to be merciful. Ned says, I am asking you to be just. He says, justice does not require punishing children for the circumstances of their birth. He says, Cersei is another matter. That is between you and the law. Stannis says, the law says treason has consequences. Ned says, yes. He says, I leave that in your hands. Stannis looks at him. He says, the Kingsguard record, Ser Jaime. Ned says, he saved 600,000 people. He says, the record should reflect that. Stannis is quiet for a long time. He says, I will consider it. Ned says, consider it carefully. He says, the world already knows the name Kingslayer. He says, it does not yet know the full story. He says, a king who reveals the full story of what Jaime did and why, and restores his honor, will be seen as just. He says, a king who continues to punish a man for saving the city will be seen as something else. Stannis says, that is a political argument. Ned says, it is also a true argument. He says, both things can be true simultaneously. Stannis almost smiles. He does not quite smile. He says, you have learned something in 11 days. Ned says, I am learning something every day. He says, I intend to continue. Stannis looks at the city. He looks at the fleet behind him. He says, I will enter the city tomorrow. He says, I want the council assembled. He says, and Stark. He says it with the quality of the almost smile that is the most warmth Stannis Baratheon has ever produced for someone who is not Davos. He says, well done. He says it the way he says things he means, which is briefly and without embellishment. He means it. King's Landing. After the first months. He stays. He had intended not to stay. He had intended to seat Stannis and go home. He had intended to go back to Winterfell and the Grey Walls and the yard where he trained and the Godswood where he prayed and the life he has been building for 20 years in the north. He stays because Stannis asks him to. Stannis asks him directly, which is the way Stannis does everything. He says, I need you here. He says, I can govern and I can be just and I can manage the law. He says, I cannot do what you did in 11 days. He says, I do not know how to open gates. He says, I need someone who does. Ned says, you are asking me to be hand. Stannis says, I am asking you to be hand. Ned says, I have a family in Winterfell. Stannis says, send for them. He says it with the pragmatism of a man who solves problems when they are presented as problems. He says, the North is well governed by your son. He says, your family can be here. Ned looks at him. He thinks about Catelyn. He thinks about Robb and Arya and Bran and Rickon and the direwolves and the specific smell of Winterfell in autumn. He thinks about what he promised Robert. Whatever it takes. He says, all right. He says, I'll stay. Stannis nods. He says, there is one other thing. Ned says, what? Stannis says, the Night's Watch. He says, I have been reading the ranging reports. He says, the ones Varys provided, the unfiltered versions. He says, Lord Stark. He says, I believe them. Ned looks at him. He says, you believe them. Stannis says, I believe the pattern. He says, I do not dismiss things because they are inconvenient. He says, that is Cersei's method, not mine. He says, the reports form a pattern and the pattern requires response. Ned says, yes, it does. Stannis says, what is the response? Ned thinks about Jon Snow. He thinks about the boy in Winterfell with Lyanna's eyes, who does not know what he is. He thinks about the wall. He thinks about fire and ice, and the things coming from beyond that only a dragon's fire can stop, and the dragon that will not exist unless Jon knows what he is and becomes what he is. He says, there is something you need to know about the succession. Stannis says, I am the succession. Ned says, there is more than you. He says it carefully. He says, Robert had no lawful heirs. He says, but there is a child. He says, a child with a claim that precedes yours, strictly speaking, if legitimacy is the standard. Stannis goes very still. Ned tells him. He tells him about the Tower of Joy, about Lyanna, about Rhaegar. He tells Stannis about Jon Snow. Stannis listens. He listens with the complete focused attention of a man who takes information seriously and processes it against the laws of succession he has memorized since childhood. When Ned finishes, Stannis says, the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. Ned says, yes. Stannis says, he would have the better claim. Ned says, yes. Stannis says, and you are telling me this. Ned says, Yes. Stannis looks at him. He says, "Why?" Ned says, "Because it is true." He says, "And because the boy is going to be needed for something that is more important than the question of who sits on the Iron Throne." He says, "And because I am not capable of hiding the truth from you when you are the king, and the truth affects the succession, and the succession affects the realm." Stannis says, "You realize this complicates things." Ned says, "Yes." Stannis says, "You could have said nothing." Ned says, "Yes." Stannis says, "Why didn't you?" Ned says, "Very simply, because it would not have been right." Stannis looks at him. He says nothing for a long time. He says, "The boy," he says. "What is he?" Ned says, "He is a boy who grew up a bastard in Winterfell, and who does not know his own name." He says, "He is also the last Targaryen, and quite possibly the only person alive who can do what needs to be done with what is coming from beyond the wall." He says, in that order. He says, he needs to know what he is. He says, he needs to be found and told and prepared. He says, whatever the succession implications, the wall comes first. Stannis says, "You want me to support this?" Ned says, "I want you to not hunt him." He says, "Everything else can be worked out." He says, "But the wall is coming, and when it comes, we will need fire." He says, "Let me go get the fire." Stannis is very quiet. He says, "You want to go north?" Ned says, "I want to go home." He says it with the specific weight of 11 days of not being home and everything those 11 days cost. He says, "And I want to tell my nephew who he is." He says, "And I want to bring him south when he is ready." He says, "And I want the realm to be prepared for what is coming." Stannis says, "And you want to be hand." Ned says, "I want to do both." He says, "I believe both are necessary." He says, "I believe I can do both if you permit it." Stannis looks at him. He says, "You are asking a great deal." Ned says, "I know." Stannis says, "You usually ask nothing for yourself." Ned says, "This is for the realm." Stannis says, "It is also for your nephew." Ned says, "Yes." He says, "Both things are true." Stannis says, "I will grant it." He says it with the flat certainty that means he has decided. He says, "Go north." He says, "Bring the boy back when he is ready." He says, "The succession question remains open until we understand the full picture." He says, "But the wall is the priority." He says, "You are right about that." Ned nods. He says, "Thank you." Stannis says, "Don't thank me." He says, "Come back with the fire." Ned goes. King's Landing. The night before Ned leaves, Ned goes to the Godswood. The Red Keep has a Godswood. He has been in it twice since he arrived. It is not like Winterfell's Godswood. It is small and trimmed, and the heart tree is there. But it looks like a heart tree that has been in the wrong climate for a long time, and has made its accommodation with the wrongness. The carved face still watches. The red leaves still fall. But the presence is quieter here. The old gods do not speak as loudly in the south. He puts his hand on the tree. He stands for a long time. He thinks about everything that has happened in 11 days. He thinks about the promise he made to Robert and the promise he made to Lyanna, and the way promises accumulate on a man over a lifetime until he is more promise than person, until the keeping is the whole of what he does. He thinks, I have been keeping promises for 15 years. He thinks, I am going home to keep the last one. Sansa finds him. She comes to the Godswood with the specific quiet of a girl who has learned that quiet is its own kind of information, that the absence of noise in a place tells you things the noise would cover. She sits beside the tree. She says, "You are leaving tomorrow." He says, "Yes." She says, "To find Jon." He says, "Yes." She says, "To tell him." He says, "Yes." He says, "It is past time." She is quiet for a moment. She says, "Will he come back here?" Ned says, "When he is ready." He says, "There are things he has to understand first." He says, "Things he has to become." She says, "He has always been something." She says it with the specific certainty of someone who has known a person their whole life and has always understood something about them that the world missed. She says, "Jon has always been something more than what everyone called him." He says, We just didn't know what. Ned looks at his daughter. He says, "You are going to be useful here." He says it with the genuine recognition of something he has been watching develop over 11 days. He says, "Your observations of the court, your understanding of the people in it." He says, "Don't let anyone underestimate you." He says, "It is an advantage when they do, but it comes at a cost. I don't want you paying longer than necessary." She says, "I know." She says it with the quiet of someone who has already decided the same thing. She says, "Father." She pauses. "What you did here, in 11 days." She says, "It was not what I expected." He says, "What did you expect?" She says, "I expected you to be the man who says the right thing and suffers for it." She says it with the honesty of someone who loves him and has watched him. She says, "That is what you have always been, the man who says the right thing and suffers for it." She says, "But this was different." She says, "You said the right thing and it worked." Ned is quiet. He says, "I don't know if it worked yet." He says, "Stannis is seated. The city is stable." He says, "Those are conditions, not outcomes." He says, "The outcomes depend on what comes next." She says, "What comes next is Jon." He says, "Yes." She says, "What does Jon do?" Ned says, "He goes north." He says, "He faces what is coming." He says, "And if what I believe is true about what he carries in his blood, he faces it with something the realm has not had for a very long time." She says, "Fire." Ned looks at her. He says, "You knew about that too." She says, "I suspected." She says, "I have been reading the history since you told me to watch and learn." She says, "The Targaryen records." She says, "Fire and ice." She says, "Jon has always been cold in the specific way of the north and something else underneath it." She says, "I could never name the something else." She says, "I think I can now." Ned says, "When did you become this perceptive?" She says, "I have always been this perceptive." She says it with the gentle correction of a daughter who has been underestimated for a long time and is done allowing the underestimation to be accurate. She says, "I simply had nothing to be perceptive about in Winterfell that mattered." She says, "This matters." Ned says, "Yes." He says it does. He puts his hand on her head. The gesture of a father who has not done it enough and is doing it now. He says, "Look after things while I am gone." She says, "I will." He says, "Write to me." She says, "Every day." He goes back to his chambers. He packs. He sleeps briefly, the specific brief sleep of a man who has too much to do and knows it, and rests for as long as the knowing permits. In the morning he rides north. The King's Road, north. 298 AC. He rides north. He rides north on the King's Road, and the city falls away behind him, and the air changes, and the sky opens, and he breathes in the first clean breath he has taken in weeks. He is going home. He is also going to do the hardest thing he has ever done, which is tell a boy who has grown up as a bastard in Winterfell that he is the last Targaryen, and that the realm needs him, and that his mother died for him, and that 14 years of not knowing was the price of keeping him safe. He rides. He thinks about what Lyanna would say. He thinks about bells. He thinks about a girl who was never afraid of anything, and who would find, he suspects, some irony in the fact that her brother rode south to save the realm and ended up staying, and is now riding north to bring the piece of the realm that matters most back with him. He rides through the neck. He crosses into the north. The air changes. He breathes it in. He thinks about the promise. Not Robert's promise. The older one. "Promise me, Ned." He has been keeping that promise for 15 years. He is going to keep it a little longer. He is going to go home and look at his nephew with Lyanna's grey eyes, and he is going to tell him the true thing at last. And then they are going to go north together. To the Wall. To what is coming. The Warden of the North, and the last Targaryen. The most honourable man in Westeros, and the boy built from fire and ice. Together. What if Ned Stark took the Iron Throne? He opened the gates. He heard the petitions. He told the truth to a king who might have used it against him and trusted the king's sense of justice to do the right thing with it. He apologized to the Kingslayer. He sent the ravens. He stayed when he wanted to leave and left when he needed to go home. He did not take the throne. He never wanted it. What he wanted was exactly what he built in 11 days. A realm that worked the way it was supposed to work. A succession that followed the law. A city that opened its gates. And then he rode north, to a boy with grey eyes who doesn't know his name yet. To the promise. To the long night. To the fire. Winterfell. Jon, the return. Jon is in the training yard when Ned arrives. This is where Jon always is in the morning. He has been in the training yard most mornings of his life, and the habit is so deep that Ned knows where to look without asking. He stands at the entrance to the yard. Jon is working through forms with a practice sword. The specific, focused repetition of someone who is not training for a session but thinking with his body, using movement to process something too large for stillness. He stops when he sees Ned. He looks at him. He says, "You came back." Ned says, "I said I would." Jon says, "The ravens, the city." Ned says, "Is still standing." He says, "Stannis is seated." He says, "The Lannisters have stood down." He says, "The petitions are heard." He says, he pauses. "It is not finished." He says, "But it is begun." Jon looks at him. He says, "You did it." Ned says, "With a great deal of help from people I underestimated." He says it with the honesty of a man who has returned from a place that revised several of his opinions. He says, "Jon," he says, "put down the sword." He says, "I need to tell you something." Jon puts down the sword. He looks at Ned. He knows. He has always known, in the way that Jon knows things that no one tells him, by the shape of the silence around them. He knows something is coming that is large, and that is about him, and he looks at Ned with the specific grey eyes that are Lyanna's eyes, that Ned has looked at for 15 years and seen everything he could not say. He says, "Tell me." Ned tells him. He sits on the bench beside the training yard, and he tells Jon Snow everything. He tells him from the beginning, which is Rhaegar and Lyanna, which is a love story that the world called a crime, and which ended in a tower in Dorne. He tells him about the Tower of Joy and Arthur Dayne and the promise. He tells him about the name she gave him, whispered in her last hours. He tells him what Robert would have done if he had known. He tells him who he is. Jon listens. He listens in the Godswood way, the complete, focused quiet of someone receiving something enormous and choosing to receive it with all of themselves rather than only the parts prepared for it. When Ned finishes, the yard is very quiet. Jon says, "Aemon Targaryen." Ned says, "Aegon." "She named you Aegon." He says it carefully. "I have been calling you Jon. I will keep calling you Jon." He says, "The name is yours to use as you see fit." Jon says, "Jon." He says it with the flat simplicity of a decision already made. He says, "I am Jon," he says. "The other name is history." He says, "Jon is what I am." Ned looks at him. He says, "Yes." He says, "It is." Jon says, "The wall." Ned says, "Yes." Jon says, "Something is coming." Ned says, "Yes." Jon says, "And fire is the answer." Ned says, "I believe so." He says, "I cannot be certain." He says, "I believe." Jon is quiet for a moment. He says, "You came back to tell me this yourself." He says, "You could have sent a letter." Ned says, "No." He says, "I could not have sent a letter." Jon says, "Why?" Ned says, "Because some things have to be said in person." He says, "Because she asked me to protect you." He says, "Because you have been asking me who your mother was with your eyes for 14 years, and you deserved to hear the answer out loud from someone who loves you." Jon says, "To you?" Ned says, "Yes." He says it with the simplicity it deserves. He says, "You are hers." He says, "She was my sister." He says, How could I not? Jon is very still. He says, what was her laugh like? Ned says, like bells. He says, silver bells on a winter morning. Jon nods. He picks up the practice sword. He says, I'm going to need better training than Sir Roderick. Ned says, yes. Jon says, I'm going to need to go to the wall. Ned says, when you are ready. Jon says, how will I know? Ned says, you will go to the wall. He says, and when you get there, you will know because the wall will tell you. He says, things announce themselves when you are ready to receive them. Jon looks at the practice sword. He sets it back down. He says, Ned. Ned says, yes. Jon says, thank you. He says it with 14 years behind it, which is not a lot of time and also a very great deal of time, which is the specific weight of everything that has lived in the silence between them and is now having its shape acknowledged. Ned says, you're welcome. He puts his hand on Jon's shoulder. The hand stays there for a moment. Then they both go inside. Catelyn has made food. Robb is waiting. Arya is waiting with the specific, impatient energy of someone who has been waiting too long and is at the limit. Bran has climbed something he was not supposed to climb and is on the wall of the Great Hall, watching from above. It is Winterfell. It is home. Ned stands in the doorway of his home, and he thinks about the 11 days in King's Landing, and the promises he kept, and the ones still to keep, and the long road north that is also the road south when the time comes. He breathes. He goes inside. He has kept the promise. The next part is beginning. He never wanted the throne. That is the whole story underneath the story. He opened the gates because it was right. He heard the petitions because people deserved to be heard. He apologized to the Kingslayer because he was wrong. He told Stannis about Jon because it was true. He did not do any of it for power. He did all of it because it needed doing, and he was the person standing there when it needed doing. And because Robert asked him to promise whatever it takes. And Ned Stark keeps his promises, even the ones that cost him everything. Even the ones that require him to sit in the chair he never wanted. Even the ones that send him riding north in the first good breath he has taken in weeks, going home to the boy with his sister's eyes to say the words that should have been said 14 years ago. Promise me, Ned. I promise. I promise. I promise. He rode north with the weight of 2 promises and the specific lightness of a man who has finally stopped apologizing for being what he is. Honest, direct, willing to say the true thing in a city built on lies. It turns out that was enough. It turns out that was the whole of what was needed. Not a player. Not a schemer. Just a man who meant what he said.